Bali Rigo Amenain, good evening everyone. Before I start, you should have all been handed a simplified family tree. Please refer to it as I proceed. For Armenians, Antonik Ozanian, otherwise known as General Antonik, is one of these epic heroes which appears once in a millennia and who, like Prince Vartavan Mamikonian, will be talked about for at least another. Handsome, courageous beyond normal, unvanquished on the battlefield, unwavering in his mission to free Armenians from the Ottoman yoke, he became a legend in his lifetime. It is no small matter that one member of our family, Levon, the first cousin of my grandfather, will share forever a part of this legend, as he was not only Antonik's friend and First World War companion, but will remain for eternity his first-hand biographer. His 500 pages book, Usher, or Souvenirs, published in the 70s, is and will remain the primary source concerning Antonik. And it is to Levon that Antonik entrusted his last will, namely that he should be buried in the monastery of the Holy Apostles. Furthermore, this unassuming, kind man was not only asked by Antonik to create, by recruiting volunteers, the decisive battalion of Salmas, or to perform missions which even the French military recognized as dangerous, but in effect became a hero when Antonik asked him to fight the outbreak of cholera when it broke among survivors of the genocide. Levon recalls in his memoirs was what most of us have forgotten or are ignorant of: bodies of Armenians stacked in piles in Echmiadzin. Thanks to this kind and courageous man, certainly tens, probably hundreds of lives were saved, something that his close relatives would never know and still do not know. As if it was not enough, at the end of the war, Levon returned to Constantinople from where he had escaped at the beginning of the war, and with other intellectuals gathered 300 or so genocide orphans on a boat and headed to Corfu in Greece. This until French authorities would grant immigration to the orphan, which they did 2 years later. You can see him here with 3 of these orphans, one not in a very good state. His kindness is obvious, and in fact, when I called in 2003 the Swiss Institution for Blind, where he spent the very last years of his life in Lausanne, the director's secretary wished to add to the conversation that he was a very kind man. This 26 years after his death. Levon, after the First World War, would find the love of his life, Countess and pianist Maria Yaroslavska in Lausanne, and for the next half-century, from their flat with an extraordinary view over the Leman Lake, would write about Armenia and the Armenians. In due course, he would become the editor of many Armenian magazines, such as Baika or Zartung. His portrait still hangs in the Boston headquarters of the Ramgavar party, for which he was a leading figure, and he would also become occasionally a journalist attached to the Société des Nations in Geneva, ancestor of the United Nations. The other reason I start with Levon is that he is so far the main historian of our family. Our family history has been reported to me by several members. My father, Antonik, foremost, and his sister, my aunt Dolly, whom I have recorded. My grand-aunt Meline, whose Christian faith, honesty, and particularly wisdom was a household knowledge, as well as her sister, my equally very pious grandmother Iskui, also tape-recorded, and her sister Lizinka. Moreover, in the 20s, my grandfather Telemaque commissioned Levon to gather all documents concerning the family. For 10 years, Levon would do so and found some original documents with the name of our family seat, which he handed to my grandfather. It ultimately resulted in a legal edition of our name, Vartavan, on the birth certificate of my father in 1931, francisized in De Vartavan, to that adopted Ottoman tobacco trade name of Tutundjian. Tutun in Turkish means tobacco. At the death of my grandfather, the file containing 10 years of research was probably taken by one of his brothers, and when their entire property was given to the Armenian church, we lost trace of it. When my father saw Levon in 1963 in Lausanne, the latter was extremely distressed to learn that this file had been lost, particularly as there were many originals at the time when there was no photocopy. Most likely because of this, Levon decided to bequeath in 1966 to the authorities of the Soviet Republic of Armenia his near entire personal archive as well as library. As a result, the Tutundjian Fund number 413 of today's National Archives of the Republic of Armenia contains 3,000 to 4,000 pages of family documents of its own catalogue. It is also likely that the other archives of many great contemporary figures with whom Levon was a friend and corresponded, like for example Tekeyan or Totovens, contain many more related to our family history. These archives will have in time to be fully investigated by professional historians. When I arrived in Armenia in 2006, I took the trouble to digitally photograph over 3 or 4 days all of the manuscript archives, not printed, amounting possibly to half of the family fund. In the process, I stumbled in archive 491 upon a letter written on July 4th, 1930 from Greece by Levon while visiting one of our ancestral work and home places to his wife, Marie, who had remained behind in Lausanne. One sentence of the letter, written in French, reads as follows: "If human life developed over generations, mine, in the person of my ancestors, would be a long adventure, successively great lord, hero, owner of tobacco fields, trader, solicitor, adventurous soldier." The adventurous soldier last name being Levon himself. As all of these ancestors mentioned by epithet, but one, the hero, are all identified. So I decided to first organize my talk around this letter and these ancestors before branching to my grandfather, my father and myself were not mentioned, as Levon's father, Ruben, was the brother of my great-grandfather, Mardiros, so a diverging branch. Secondly, I will equally concentrate in this talk on the influence which our family had in history, since Hovakim Sarpazan was very kind to state we had one. I must stress that this is the first time in 300 years that our family history is presented to any public, but for books and articles and specific historical figures with whom we were deeply connected, and which Levon published over half a century in many publications. To select a more vast, private, photographic and printed archive that was relevant to tell over 45 minutes, nearly 300 years of family history is not easy at all. And I apologize if there is a lot to take in. But following the principle that the picture is worth 1,000 words, I have selected quite a few. After careful study, family members, including myself, can be divided over 8 generations in 4 successive groups: the princes, the traders, the nationalists, and the internationalists. The princes. They lived during the early 18th century. One is known of all family members as Melik Vartavan. It is the great lord, grand seigneur in French, to which Léon referred in his letter. Our oral tradition first reports that he comes from the Melik of Khamsa of Artsakh, that he lives in Vartavan, or comes down from Vartavan, and that we descend directly from him. There is more about him, but before I get to that, let's put him in the historical context of his time and one of utmost importance for Armenians as it touches, like with Antranik, to their sovereignty and hence freedom. After the Battle of Bakurvan in 775 AD, and after the Armenian army is crushed by the Abbasid Arabs, a political vacuum is created which forces nearly all major princely houses to migrate to Constantinople, but 2 of them, the Artsaruni and Bagratuni houses, which will raise to kingship. In particular the Bagratuni, who at the time of the Ashahuni kings of Armenia had been not only given the title of Aspet, or master of the horse, and hence the cavalry, but also of Takadir, or crown holder, during coronations. First crowned in AD 884, by 1000 AD, the Bagratuni kingdom also included, at least nominally, Artsakh, what is today Karabakh, here on the map, but also Syunik, here, the adjacent southern Armenian province. After the fall of the Bagratid capital of Ani in 1045 and the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Seljuk Turks defeated the Byzantine and hence changed the course of history, the Bagratid realm disappears and leaves the 2 kingdoms of Syunik and Artsakh as last bastions of Armenian sovereignty. Artsakh at the time was ruled from immemorial time by a branch of the Aranshahid dynasty. In 1214, one of them, called Vartan, ruled and married a Zakharian princess, Horisha, who was the daughter of the 2 royal Bagratid and Artsaruni houses. When Vartan died that year, his son Hassan Jalal inherited his land, and although already addressed as king, he officially took the title of King of Artsakh and Park when he married the daughter of the last king of Dizak, Park. Park is a county in Syunik immediately adjacent to Dizak, to the west, here, on which we will come back, as this is where Vartavan is. It is Hassan Jalal who commissioned the building of the cathedral of the Gantzazan monastery in his principality of Khachen. Gantzazar will over centuries see many members of the Hassan Jalalian as patriots, such as here Sarkis Hassan Jalalian. The cathedral, inaugurated on July 22, 1240, by 700 attendees, is in use till this day, hence 779 years later. Lateral descendants of a Vartan, Hassan Jalalian, who established the building of Dizak Park in the late 16th century. All other three Melik domes, those of Varanda, Jarben, and Gulistan, were created later. This is an important point, as Levon told my father that he had been able to trace the family almost 1,000 years. And the only family which can do this is Artsakh, and Artsakh is the Hassan Jalalian family. Moreover, as I said before, the Principality of Dizak, here, also included the county of Bark in Sunik, here. And this is precisely where Vartavan is today, a small village which has long thought to be the origin of our name. Vartavan is today a small village which has long thought to be the origin of our name, but this may perhaps not be so. An intricate web of intermarriages linked all five principalities of Khamsa, and they could unify in times of war. And war there certainly was. The Principality of Dizak, on which Vartavan was headed by the Melik Avanian family, or the Melik Avan family, itself a branch of the Loris Melikov of Georgia, the coat of arms of whom is basically the same as ours, with lions and tower. Melik Avan is a heroic figure of the War of Liberation of Sunik led by David Beg. Prince David, born in Sunik but educated in Georgia, was sent by the king of Georgia to clean Sunik of the Ottomans. His 722 to 728 War of Liberation took epic proportions. The son of the great lord, Ait Melik Vartavan, who was probably himself born before 1700, is referred in Levon's letter as a hero. And it is very likely that he participated to this revolt, which not only coincided with his time, but basically took place around Vartavan. Unless the hero is Melik Avan's son, Esai, who also rid Garba in one night of all Ottoman troops, and for this is also called a hero. This is forgotten today. Levon knew exactly who he was, and it is a matter of time before historians find out. In any case, the oral tradition of the family picks up precisely between the end of the David Beg revolt, hence 1728, and the Garabach massacre of the Saint Bartholomew in 1744. Indeed, around 1730, precisely 1735, said my father, the Ottoman Sultan, hence Mahmud I, invited, as precisely recorded in the family oral tradition, this word is extremely important, my ancestor, the Melik Vartavan, to take at least one monopoly of tobacco of the Ottoman Empire. You have here, incidentally, a very rare engraving of a Melik of Garba from a German contemporary publication. Note the sword-shaped cross, which we sometimes see on soldiers today, on which we will come back if we have time. Our family, the oral tradition continues, was very well known at the time and had direct connections with the court of the Sultan, this betraying extensive trade, if not political, connections. This invitation suggests first that we were on the Silk Road, of which you see here the main arteries, at least during the 16th century, probably much earlier. Second, that the gift of the monopolies almost certainly involved a very substantial down payment which only a family with wealth and probably power could have. Precisely such as had the Melik Avanian, since Melik Avan was able to pay for the food of the entire Persian army for a whole year, the record says. Where did he get his fortune, otherwise recorded at his very lavish table, is not known to me. Certainly in part from his notorious spoils of war, but perhaps also trade. Tobacco? What is sure is that the tobacco commodity depended, unlike all other commodities, directly from the Sultan in view of the wealth it already generated at that time. And because of this, it had its own separate custom. To get such invitation was an opportunity which my ancestor, the Melik Vartavan, certainly did not miss. And he did well, as it would bring wealth to our family until 1948. It is very likely that he traveled to the palace of Topkapi and was received in that very room to obtain the firman, which allowed him to trade the precious commodity. As was then the custom in the Ottoman Empire, he took the name of his trade, in other words Tutunji, from Turkish tutun, tobacco, to which was later attached the Armenian suffix ayan. The Tutundjian de Vartavan thus entered in an era which would have far consequence for the future of Armenia, and which is from then even more precisely recorded. Between 1735 and 1750, the family must have started trading tobacco. It is interesting to see that up to at least the 70s, tobacco was still planted around Vartavan. In any case, around 1750, the family, probably engrossed by early profits, decided to leave Karabakh unique and move to Constantinople. Their offices were open, and we get into the next group of ancestors, the traders. Before doing so, here are two tobacco boxes produced by our Bulgarian branch, one pre-1914 and the other in the 20s, bearing our name. Some of the elements of the older box seem to refer to Royal Armenia. The traders. Haji Bedros, circa 1750 to around 1820, and his son Stepan, who was born circa 1800 and who died in 1860. Upon arriving in Constantinople, a central office was opened, and, as was often the tradition in Armenian trade, the family split in three branches. One stayed in Constantinople, the other went to Sofia in Bulgaria, and the third to Kavala in northern Greece. Our family branch is that of Kavala and Constantinople. Once in Kavala, terrains were bought 20 miles north in hilly Drama, probably by Haji Bedros and certainly owned by him at one point, and tobacco was grown on them. A house with a large garden was also bought, and an office opened. Precise private family memories about the wedding and the plague survive from this time. A very precise record also exists of the employment of future Viceroy of Egypt Muhammad Ali, who returned to Kavala penniless after the defeat of the Ottoman army by Bonaparte near Alexandria in Egypt in 1799. In the 30s, King Fuad I asked for the employment contract of his ancestor, and it is likely to be now archived in the Royal Archives of Abdin Palace in Cairo. Levon published an article about this in Egypt at that time. During his reign, Muhammad Ali would appoint several Armenians as ministers. During the next 70 years or so, hence until the early 1820s, tobacco was grown by our family in Drama, carried down to the harbor of Kavala and shipped to Constantinople. With time, other trade posts, most certainly each with its own tobacco plantations, were set up in Samsun and Trebizond along the Black Sea coast. The new Tutundjians, as Haji Bedros seems to have been the first to bear this name, made a fortune. It allowed them to move back to Constantinople at the beginning of the 18th century, probably after Sultan Mahmud II made a sanitary cleaning in Constantinople of both the plague and the Yenicheris, i.e. the Janissaries, who had become a power within the power. Thousands of these were slaughtered in one night and cast into the Bosphorus. This happened on June 15, 1826. At that point, Haji Bedros must have been aged and trading probably past his son Stepan, the trader to whom Levon refers in his letter, and his grandfather, that is Levon's grandfather. A photograph of Stepan survives stuck in the belt of one of his grandsons during an 1889 family photo we shall see in a minute. An enlargement shows a man with a moustache and jacket of the 1840s, taken at the time when his two sons, Mardiros and Ruben, were born. What is important about Stepan is that his fortune gave him the leisure to study the history of Armenia, and ultimately produce a book about the king of Armenia, the manuscript of which is mentioned but has for now disappeared. This would be the first of a very long series of patriotic publications by the family. From the reign of Sultan Mahmud II to the progressive reign of his successor Abdul Mejid, who died in 1861, Armenians were treated better than ever before. Stepan died on the 3rd of October 1860, hence 1 year before the Sultan, in Beşiktaş, i.e. near where the new imperial palace was, and this was probably not a coincidence. His son Mardiros, the uncle of Levon and my great-grandfather, is known to have had connection with the pashas of the court, and in fact, as we shall see, this would ultimately save his life. With the new reign of Abdul Aziz, things unfortunately deteriorated, particularly after Germany defeated France in 1871, as Abdul Aziz pushed forward for a more Islamic ideal. Our family, influenced by French culture and the French Revolution, pushed for a more Armenian ideal, and in fact, at a time when this did not make unanimity with many Ottoman Armenians, particularly the rich and powerful class of the Amiras. And we pushed for Armenian independence. Armenian independence. Since the fall of the kingdom of the Bagratid, which I have mentioned, historical Armenia per se had not seen a sovereign Armenian nation. Silesia during the Middle Age had seen a transferred Armenian kingdom which lasted a few centuries. Over half a millennia of Turkish domination had tamed the fighting spirit of most of the Armenian population in the vilayets or districts of the empire, the Ottoman Empire. The fighting spirit of the Meliks had, however, not left at all our family, and it is not surprising that it would thrive with all its heart for Armenian sovereignty. Again, the revolutionary ideals of France, which had led Greece to be independent by 1830, would lead our family members not to thrive for a monarchy, but a republic. The very name of my grandfather, born in 1880, betrays these ideals, as he was called Telemaque by his parents. Indeed, Fénelon's 1699 Telemaque was translated in Armenian in 1860. Telemaque was a scathing rebuke of two of the autocratic reign of Louis XIV of France. The book was immediately translated across Europe in many languages, radicalized the future Louis XV, marked profoundly Montesquieu and Rousseau, who laid with Voltaire the foundation of the French Revolution. Now, the patriots. We now come to the patriots. When Stepan dies in 1860, his sons Mardiros and Ruben are still young. Ruben is 15, and Mardiros, his brother and my great-grandfather, probably slightly older. The family is extremely rich, but it would seem that Mardiros continued commercial activities, as Ruben, reports Theotique, would become later in 1885 one of the very first solicitors of the Ottoman Empire. Theotique, whose almanac of everyone, Amenain Daritsuitsa, is in almost every Armenian home. He writes that Ruben's passion for history and philology leads him to write various texts. Ruben, reports Theotique, would become later in 1885 one of the very first solicitors of the Ottoman Empire. Theotique, whose almanac of everyone, Amenain Daritsuitsa, is in almost every Armenian home, writes that Ruben's passion for history and philology leads him to write various texts. In fact, Ruben, consciously or not, follows Stepan's movement of emancipation of the Armenian people. By 1874, hence when 29, he composes a theatrical play entitled Queen Zabel, Zabel Takuhi, the original manuscript of which is today in the Tutundjian archive in Yerevan. The choice of the topic is everything but innocent. Queen Isabella was the queen regnant of the Armenian kingdom of Silesia from 1219 until her death. The play aimed to revive nationalistic feelings exactly like Verdi's 1842 Nabucco to free Italy from the Austrian yoke. Queen Zabel was played for the first time in 1875 for the inauguration of the new Aramian theatre in Kadıköy. Bedros Atamian, perhaps the greatest Armenian actor of all time, Siranush, who was at her debut, played respectively Queen Zabel and her husband King Hetum. I would not be surprised at all to learn that the play was financed by our family. Another play about King Behram Shapur and the invention of the alphabet by Meshrop Mashdot was never played, but the theme betrays again the patriotism of its author. In 1889, Ruben publishes a novel entitled Satanik der Tad, which is a sort of Romeo and Juliet type of story set in Constantinople. The novel, amusingly, will force Armenian authorities to build a wall around the main Armenian cemetery, as families till then came to do their barbecues there between tombs during weekends. More importantly, it lobbied for the education of young women left at the time in complete ignorance. What? You know French? And I thought you were a decent girl, yells a lady of the novel during a dinner. Perhaps is it for this reason that Ruben becomes later the director of the Armenian school of Kadıköy, where our family has now moved on the other side of the Bosphorus and away from the more and more dangerous palace and center of town. This would prove very wise. Where family history is concerned, the novel opens with a dedication to Stepan. It indicates by B the name of Stepan's father, Bedros, the Haji Bedros I mentioned earlier, and which Levon refers in his letter as the tobacco trader, as well as the date and place of Stepan's death. Levon, in 1971, will dedicate his memoir to his father Ruben, and there again, Stepan's name appears in full. In fact, the very same year the novel is published, i.e. 1889. His brother Mardiros, with his wife Aravni and his 4 sons, Armenak, Telemaque, Herant and Mirhan, are photographed while having a promenade on Paris Street, Constantinople Champs-Élysées. Mardiros has the same moustache than his brother, but also of his father Stepan, whose photograph is stuck in Mihran's belt. It is the magnification of this photograph which I showed you earlier. The boy immediately near Mihran is my grandfather Telemaque, whose life and superior intelligence will be decisive for the future of Armenians. As to Aravni, she is equally known for her intelligence, and this will soon show. Indeed, just a year before, and following the Berlin Congress of 1888, the condition of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire rapidly deteriorates. Since 1876 reigns Abdul Hamid, who, following the territorial reduction of the Ottoman Empire, followed more than ever the role to Islamization took by his immediate predecessors. As a response to the increasing vexations of Armenians in Anatolia, England walks in asking for the creation of an autonomous Armenian province within the empire. This flares not only Abdul Hamid's resentment, but triggers the birth of revolutionary Armenian groups who see a path to independence. As a result, in 1889, Kurds are encouraged by Abdul Hamid to harass Armenians in the far eastern provinces, whereas in 1894, harassments turned into massacres, with this time a first intervention of Western powers. August 22, 1896. The Ottoman Bank is taken by 26 Armenian revolutionaries who want to raise further awareness on the Armenian cause and wants to trigger an action by the European powers. Within 2 days of the occupation of the bank, Abdul Hamid unleashes the mob on the Armenian population of Constantinople with orders to kill everyone, irrespective of gender or age. Within hours, 3,000 to 4,000 civilian Armenians are massacred in a gigantic bloodbath. Telemaque, who you see here, with a hand on his father Mardiros' shoulder, and who is 16, sees something as he returns home and grabs a kitchen knife. As he is about to go out, Aravni, his mother, asks, "Where are you going, young man?" "I'm going to kill a Turk," he replies. She says, in reply, "Go to your room immediately." When Mardiros, her husband, returns home, Aravni is waiting for him and says, "Mardiros, I think the time for us to leave the Ottoman Empire has come." And Mardiros has just been informed by a Turkish Pasha of the court, who is a friend of his, that he is on the second hanging list of prominent Armenians. The first list has already been hanged, and it will in fact trigger another intervention of Western powers. So his reply is brief: "I also think so." The family fools the Turkish police, and taking the Orient Express goes to Hoshchuk in Bulgaria, where some of the cousins of the Bulgarian branch of the Tutundjian family live. This photograph was taken there, but a few years later. Hence all possessions, including timeless souvenirs, furniture, buildings and land, is left behind in Constantinople and will be nationalized in 1927 by the Turkish government. Thus ends 150 years of family life in the Ottoman Empire, and starts an open fight for the creation of a sovereign Armenia. The nationalists. These are Telemaque, my grandfather, born in 1880 and who died in 1933, and Levon, his first cousin, born in 1892 and who died in 1977. From Hoshchuk, Mardiros sends his 2 eldest sons to study in Switzerland, Armenac and Telemaque, my grandfather, who arrives in Lausanne in 1900. Swiss police records, traced in less than 20 minutes in 2003, show their coming and goings between 1900 and 1904. Armenac, the elder, registers himself as coming from Turkey. Telemaque as coming from Armenia at the time when Armenia does not exist. The tone is set, and Telemaque will work relentlessly for the birth of the First Republic of Armenia. And he landed at the right place and at the right time. Switzerland is a hub for revolutionaries, and Telemaque has already joins the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, otherwise known as Tashnak Sutun. In fact, it seems that he is one of its early members. What is certain is that he befriends Avedis Haharonian, and both, as Lausanne University law students, elaborate lengthy plans for the birth of the First Republic. On May 28, 1918, hence 18 years later, Avedis, as chairman of the Armenian National Council, will pronounce the independence of Armenia. Another dream was the birth of a Jewish state, and by some twist of fate, Telemaque befriends a Jewish student, named Chaim Weizmann, who has the same nationalistic dream for his people. One day, Chaim says to Telemaque, "Come to the Zionist Congress of Bâle. You will represent the Armenians." We do not know if Telemaque went, but Chaim, in 1948, will become the first president of the independent state of Israel. But at the time, these are but dreams for idealist students, and power, particularly money, is needed to achieve them. Telemaque's studies are more than brilliant. At 24, he is a doctor of the Faculty of Law, and his landmark thesis deals obviously with the rights of non-Muslim minorities in the Ottoman Empire. It is a model of clarity and obtains an elogious review in France. But the money questions reappears for the family and for the visionary goal. Armenak, who has obtained one of the first electrical diploma in the world, is offered £100 in gold as monthly salary to build the tramway of Alexandria in Egypt with a Swiss firm. A salary indeed in gold. In 1905, from Egypt, from Alexandria, he telegraphed his younger brother to join him as Egypt, with the cotton industry, is in a full boom. Soon after, Telemaque lands in Egypt and registers at the mixed tribunals of Alexandria, the famous Tribunaux Mixtes d'Alexandrie, and starts his career as solicitor. By 1918, he has made for himself the extraordinary fortune of £50,000 in gold, equivalent to several millions of today. Apparently, he never loses a case. By 1918, he's made for himself the extraordinary fortune of £50,000 in gold, equivalent to several millions of today. Apparently, he never loses a case. In between, the family has left Bulgaria, and all share a very large apartment, itself divided in sub-apartments in Alexandria. The younger brothers, who have not gone to university, ask Telemaque funds to recreate the family company to trade. Armenak joins, as he will never replace a Swiss director. The 8 Tutundjian brothers, named after the elder brother, is born and will first take the family to Japan, then China, and open an open trade post in Yokohama and Hong Kong. This photograph of Armenak and Telemaque was taken in Yokohama in 1918. There is no time today to relate the adventures of our family in Asia. From Armenak's training in jiu-jitsu with the last samurais to negotiating with a Chinese warlord, this would take too much time. But the idea of mixing Chinese with Egyptian tobacco and selling it in Europe makes the family rich again. And again, this money is put to use for the sacred goal of the independence of Armenia. Telemaque's stature has grown not only with Armenians, but first with Egyptians, in fact, the Japanese and the Chinese. We see here the premises of an internationalization of the family. Telemaque notices that the Chinese sailors arriving with our tobacco ships live in Alexandria in miserable conditions. So he funds a Chinese seamen's club, which soon after, because of his legal expertise, becomes the first consulate of China in Egypt. He has factually established the first diplomatic relation of Egypt with China, and soon after does the same with Japan. Because of this, we believe, he is made a Bey of Egypt by King Fuad I, who is a reformer. He continues assiduously to work on the creation of the First Republic, and this photograph speaks for itself. He is here on the right, sitting with Simon Veratzian, who will become the last prime minister of the short-lived First Republic of Armenia. Near Veratzian is Hovhannes Kajazmuni, who became the first prime minister of the same republic on June 16, 1918 and until August 1919. Armenia becomes independent on the 28th of May 1918. Because of his position in Egypt, it is Telemaque who accompanies in August 1920 Prime Minister Alexander Khadisyan to see King Fuad in his Cairo palace. Khadisyan then visits Egypt to establish diplomatic relations and raise money for the new Republic of Armenia. On the occasion, Telemaque is further elevated as Grand Officer of the Order of the Nile. Khadisyan later recorded this visit in his memoir, stating that he had received the greatest of help in his mission by my grandfather. Telemaque has indeed become Secretary of the Boring, one of the most crucial of positions, as he is de facto the guardian of the money raised in Egypt for the construction of the Republic. And the Armenian community of Egypt is at the time perhaps the richest in the world. The public speech which Telemaque makes in a packed full theatre is reported in extenso in Archival, the main Armenian daily of Egypt. Equally, the dinner offered to the Prime Minister by our family in our home, or the gala dinner offered in his presence in the luxurious Hotel San Stefano. During that dinner, as further recorded in Narev, the four Tutundjian brothers put on the table £100 in gold for the Republic, almost the equivalent of a bank's employee's yearly salary. The hundreds of guests follow, and the women take off their jewels, in gold or not, to put them in the baskets provided. All is placed under control of Telemaque, who transfers the money to the National Bank of Greece under direct control of the President of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos, perhaps the greatest president Greece ever had. Eleftherios and Telemaque appreciate each other and become friends. By December 1920, weakened by its war with Turkey, the First Republic of Armenia falls under the power of the Bolsheviks. The Soviet Republic of Armenia would thereafter integrate the Soviet Union on March 4, 1922. But for now, the government had to escape the Bolsheviks. Among them, the Minister of Education, Nicolas Arpalian, and some of his suite, who was revered and still is for having created Yerevan State University. Telemaque, who had been elected the chief of the Armenian community of Alexandria, not only welcomed them, but gave Arpalian the job of director of the Bogosian school, a school housed within the complex of the Patriarchate of Alexandria. Telemaque had in fact previously designed the educative program of that school. As a reward for his generosity and during a business trip to Hamburg, Nicolas Arpalian and his friends spent the money of the community. And when Telemaque returned, they asked the money of the Republic, which was due to be returned to donators in view of the takeover by the Bolsheviks. Not on the account of the illicit spending, but officially for the additional neglect of his task of school director, Telemaque fired Arpalian from his job and categorically refused to hand over the treasure of the Republic. What happened next is related by historian Topuzzian in a book published by the Armenian Soviet Academy of Science in 1978. One night, the 21st of October, while the civil committee met at the Patriarchate, 30 to 35 Tashnag forced the doors, assaulting Telemaque Tutundjian and a priest, then destroyed the new furniture. Blood was spilled, and police came quickly. After interrogation, they confiscated the keys of the Patriarchate, which they closed. The 30th of October, 500 to 600 of the Populist Party demonstrated against the new committee the Tashnag Sutun had created. The latter would be declared illegal very soon by the Patriarch. My grandfather's ribs were broken and his life saved at the last minute by his bodyguard. As my grandmother Iskoui said, how on earth could a minister of education do such a thing? My grandmother marries my grandfather 2 months later, and Telemaque has seemingly recovered. My grandmother is half Kuyumjan by her father, Karnik Bey, and half Gulbenkian by her mother, Rose Gulbenkian. The father of Karnik Bey is Hagop Pasha, who ruled until 1930 over his dynasty in Baghdad in Iraq. Karnik's wife, Rose Gulbenkian, is the daughter of Ohannes Pasha Gulbenkian. The name Gulbenkian is an immediate translation of the Byzantine-era Vart Badrig, and they are the descendants of the imperial Kuropalets Vart Badrig of the Rushtuni princely house. Rose is also the first cousin of Kaluz Gulbenkian, whom you will have heard of because of the present existing foundation, and they are childhood friends. The Kuyumjan Gulbenkian live in their castles in Fallujah, large mansions really. And even King Faisal, who dealt with Lawrence of Arabia, stops by for tea. Rose, my great-grandmother, is seated just near him, in between my cousin Margot, who is now today buried in London. So Iskoui, with her mother, Rose, and her sister, my great-aunt, Melina Nizinka, moved to our family home in Alexandria. At that point in time, Tutundjian de Vartavan, Kuyumjan, and Gulbenkian lived together as one. Other Gulbenkian cousins, who arrived separately in Egypt, join in. Telemaque's broken ribs mended well, but unfortunately a cancer of the spinal cord started 1 or 2 years later. At that point, the Arpalian affair is now in the hands of the Prime Minister of Egypt, Nahas Pasha. In 1933, the mixed tribunals condemned Arpalian and his accomplices to prison. At that point, the king asks my grandfather if he wants to send them to the Red Sea prison of El Tor, which, in view of the local conditions, meant a certain death, or just banishment from Egypt. Telemaque responded to Fouad that he fought all his life for Armenians and hence could not do that. So they were banished for life and went to Lebanon. On his deathbed, as reproduced by the press in a top front page obituary, Telemaque expressed his hope for the future of Armenia. The Tashnak-Sutun party did all efforts to raise his memory, as jailing Arpalian was regarded as unforgivable. This is particularly apparent in Professor Ovanesyan's 3 volumes on the Republic of Armenia, where Telemaque is deleted. In the very same sentence, word for word, I read earlier from Radisson's memoir. This terrible event will be remembered by the Armenian community until the 1980s, when it was discussed in Alexandria and in my presence between Archbishop Tutundjian and my father. It would have 2 immediate, direct consequences. The first is that the attendance of the Armenian National School, as reported to Puzian, went dwindling. Parents did not want to put their children there anymore. And this included Telemaque, who, also wanting his children to have a broader horizon than the pan-Armenian one, told my grandmother about his children. You will put the girl in the French school and the boy at the British boys' school. This would trigger a new era concerning both my father and I. Telemaque closed his eyes forever on April 4th, 1933. Although private inhumation, from word of mouth, hundreds of Armenians and Alexandrians came to the cemetery and surrounded the family plot where Mardiros and Aravni already lied, and where the 3 other brothers within succession joined him. The shock of his loss was immense, as may be witnessed on the faces of my great aunt, who from then on, with my grandmother, took care of the girl and of the boy. The internationalists. And so it happened. Donny went to the French school, and Antranik, her younger brother, and my father, born in 1931, to the Memphis Preparatory School, British school. Thereafter to the British boys' school, where he will stay until his matriculation. Thus will start a binding relation with England and British authorities. During the war, my aunts find a job in the British Army's Officers' Club, and as a scout, as you see here, my father bumps into Winston Churchill on his way to Tehran. British officers, like here Commander Simpson, come to our sea-facing house. Many British soldiers also come for tea, several of whom will not return from El Alamein and whose graves we found there later. British authorities entrust us with the 6 daughters of Emperor Haile Selassie, as they are otherwise locked in their girls' boarding school. Another person who is locked in his boarding school is Prince Hussein, future King of Jordan. Hussein played, in his youth, for hours on the carpet of our dining room under the watch of Rose, who had welcomed his grandfather Faisal in Fallujah a quarter of a century before. My father is educated at the British boys' school, like an Englishman, and ultimately gets his matriculation. Post-war is not entirely unpleasant, with endless parties, but the war has eaten our fortune. Rose writes privately to Calouste for my father's studies. Calouste knows what happened to Telemaque and will secretly pay all of his university studies from his personal purse. He is then accepted at Imperial College, more because he is a swimming champion than for any other reason. He swims and wins for the University of London, and it appears in the press. Calouste asks him humorously during a tea at the Ritz where he lived, or where he was frequently, whether he had come to England to study or to go to the Olympics. At the end of his studies, Anthony gets a priceless MA in plastics from Imperial College, one of the very first in the world. But the question of money reappears, particularly as no men of the family in Egypt are any more capable of working. ICI Brazil offers him a job, and he crosses the Atlantic in the bottom cabin alone and lands in Rio de Janeiro on the 15th of September 1955. Once in Brazil, he lives in São Paulo, works at ICI, and reads a lot about the country, and in fact, every morning he takes his breakfast at the bar below his flat, as shown in this photograph. One day, another man does the same and engages conversation, particularly about the future of Brazil. My father, sector by sector of the industry, provides his forecasts, an inborn talent he will keep all his life. The man is amazed and asks whether he would be willing to make an article, and my father says, yes, of course. The man is no other than Hernani Tavares de Sá, the founder and general editor of the most visionary Brazilian magazine of the time, author of a book entitled The Brazilians, People of Tomorrow. He will also become one day an Under-Secretary of the United Nations. Antranik and Hernani continue their initial discussion, and on January 3, 1958, Vizal, publishes an article entitled, "This is what's going to happen." Antoine and Hernani continue their initial discussion, and on January the 3rd, 1958, Vizau publishes an article entitled, "This is what is going to happen in 1958." By a certain M.A. Tutundjian, a student of our economy, says Hernani in his editor. Sector by industrial sector, Antoine gives economical provisions. Bear in mind that 1958 is a turning point in Brazilian history. It's the very year President Juscelino Kubitschek decides that Brazil should do an economical leap of 50 years in 5. With icing on the cake, Kubitschek builds a brand new capital, Brasilia. For one, the article creates a seismic shock in Brazil. First, all embassies wired to their respective capitals. For two, President Kubitschek reads it himself and picks up the phone. Soon after, ICA gets a phone call from Catete, the presidential palace, if a certain Tutundjian could be borrowed. ICA is too happy to comply, and my father finds himself in the JCOM, the group devoted to the creation of the new Brazilian automobile industry. On the first meeting, Kubitschek is invisible. But on the second one, my father is the speaker, and 5 minutes after start, Kubitschek appears. The president listens, and when he gets out, says to his secretary, "In my office, as soon as possible." This is how my father finds himself at the age of 27, sitting alone with one of the most powerful leaders of the world. At one point, Kubitschek says, "You see these piles of files on my desk, Antonio." He could not say the Armenian Antrani. "They are from every major car manufacturer of the world, and they all try to bribe me to give them the contract of the new Brazilian automobile industry. Which one would you pick?" Without a single hesitation, my father says, "Volkswagen." Kubitschek is surprised and says, but why? And my father answers, "It's very simple. With my engineers, we dismantled and reassembled the Volkswagen, and we have all the primary materials in Brazil to replicate it. The wheel axle will have, however, to be reinforced for the conditions of Brazilian roads." Kubitschek knew by instinct that nothing could corrupt this young man, and this is how, till this day, Volkswagen does not know how it got the multi-billion-dollar contract from Brazil. Later, President Kubitschek and Antoine would often work together. Kubitschek on one side of the desk and Antoine on the other. During the next years, my father will participate in the development of Brazil. You see him here at the Coffee Institute. The 6 years spent in Brazil made him yearn for his family. During that period, Calouste exchanged some letters with him. Rose and Armenac died, and in Egypt the family survives also with what my father sends. Dolly, with her husband, migrates from Beirut to Paris, and Antoine decides to settle in France. In 1963, he will meet a French woman of extraordinary kindness and beauty and will immediately marry her. They are still together as we speak. His career will be that of a brilliant engineer who will defeat on his own a French bank and its corrupted lawyers, which had ruined many French families. There's no time to talk about this, but it was an epic feat and an extremely costly one. In 1965 was born his first son, myself, and my brother Laurent in 1967, which now brings the story to me. To talk about myself in public is really contrary to my education, but I guess our story would not be complete without mine. I will, however, shorten it, as my life, moreover, has been rather eventful. I will skip my youth, except by saying that I've had the mother everyone dreams of, the love of my grandmothers and aunts, and a terribly difficult father. What is important is that my aunts, with their letters from Egypt, triggered since the age of 4 a vocation in me for Egyptology. By the age of 14, a strong sense of being Armenian woke up, and you see me here in my French boarding school, clothed as a Cossack, simply because no Armenian clothing was available at the time. Fear not, this was a one-off occasion, and I certainly did not roam France in this attire. The presence, however, of the Iranian princes, whose parents had fled Khomeini's revolution, was far more constant. In a strange, renewed and chemical alliance, Persian and Armenian princes, including in my next Switzerland boarding school, would fight Arabs and other foes together. It is apparently difficult to escape one's atavism, even when the French educative varnish is thick. One thing my French boarding school life taught me is that, despite having a French mother, I was not really French. By the age of 16, I knew ancient Egyptian and had participated in my first archaeological excavation. You see here Arthur, a Gaul, whom I baptized so and whom I had to disturb in his sleep as bulldozers were coming. Thanks to this experience and my knowledge of Egypt, I was accepted at UCL in London for archaeology in 1984. 4 years later, on May 18, 1988, I got the top front and back of the Times for discovering part of the treasure of Tutankhamun's tomb in Kew Royal Botanical Garden. This remains a unique honor in the history of Egyptology. Partly because of this, the Egyptian government exceptionally opened the Tutankhamun Reserve of the Cairo Museum for my PhD, the viva of which took place in 1994. Talking of influence, my Tutankhamun research was not without impact in UK, as you can see, or here. I returned to my family in France at the end of the 90s, from England. And then I was involved with Artsakh for several years. And on this occasion met with my father, President Arkady Rogassian. 20 years later, in 2008, the new methodologies I developed in Egyptology, and 20 years later, in 2008, the new methodologies I developed and published during my doctoral thesis were hailed as the type examples of the new scientific Egyptology, and this at the start of a book published by Cambridge University and entitled Egyptology Today. In between, I have left France in 2006 to open the first Egyptology Center of the History of Armenia in Yerevan State University. Some of the works I did with the royal mummies in Cairo found itself in the university press. In 2008, I will witness directly and be involved in the revolution initiated by Nikol Pashinyan, who is the current Prime Minister of Armenia, and whom I knew intimately since 2000. This could be the topic of another talk. Because of my Tutankhamun discoveries in 2010, while still director of the center, Oxford University made me the near unique honor to open an archive in my name and in my lifetime. Near unique as except for Professor O'Connor of Australia, all other 110 great names of Egyptology of the archives are dead. In 2014, the archives was extended to keep my personal correspondence. That very same year again, I resigned from my lifetime position in Yerevan State University to return to France to resolve grave family matters, which would take 2.5 years. In 2016, I published the first vocalized dictionary of ancient Egyptian ever seen, and put the manuscript online for free with all my publications, 10 books and 40 articles. And then I've put a stop to my Egyptology career, that is 40 scientific discoveries later. Learning suddenly of Brexit, I decided to return to the United Kingdom, fight it, including an early article for a second referendum for which I've received Dominic Grieve's thanks, and open my own consultancy in new technologies to bring the country forward in case of Brexit, particularly concerning blockchain, artificial intelligence or quantum computing. Within 2 months of returning, the Linnean Society, the most prestigious naturalist society in the world, elected me as a fellow. At about the same time, in October 2017, the current Minister of Transportation, Grant Shapps, invited me to join Parliament's APPG on blockchain, where I became an auditor, then a speaker, then recently a permanent board member. I now sit regularly in private committees of peers and MPs in the House of Lords and advise, whenever possible, the British government on blockchain and AI. This year, Lord Clement Jones invited me to join the APPG on AI, also in the House of Lords. Then the Royal Society of Arts also elected me as a fellow. So all in all, I guess coming back to the UK was not such a bad idea. But most importantly, not only I met my close cousin, Judge Paul Gulbenkian, here seated, but I met the lovely lady who sits near him and who is Professor Karen Jennings, and who is a senior staff member in Buckingham Palace. Thanks to Karen and no less God's amazing grace, I found myself partially living in Buckingham Palace, and as I could not be there unannounced, I wrote to Her Majesty the Queen to inform her of my presence in her London home and of my Armenian ancestry. Also of how Persian Armenian kings used once upon a time to move on horse with their courts. And remembering Her Majesty's notorious love of horses, I offered her a poem written not for her, but for myself, called The Call of the Horse, and speaking of what neither time nor education can erase in us. What we really are is not so much in our name or even titles, but in our blood and what we do with it. Her Majesty was kind enough to honor me with replies for a lady-in-waiting, thanking for the poem and for detailing my ancestry. As my poem dealt with atavism, I will now return to Livon's text and finish this talk with it, as it, in fact, also does speak about it. If human life, developed over generations, Mine, in the person of my ancestors, would be a long adventure. Successively, great lord, hero, owner of tobacco fields, trader, solicitor, adventurous soldier, directing ideas, leaders of people. If we had an offspring, I do not know where he would have led the adventure. In any case, I have noticed that atavism comes irresistibly back among the 7th generation. Thank you for your attention.